Welcome to Biztech's CEO Conversation Show, the show where we feature CEOs across the region who are making an impact. Today we speak with Henry Nguyen. He is currently the CEO of Timo, Vietnam's pioneer digital bank, and the chairman of Phoenix Holdings, an investment holding company that focuses on operations in technology, retail and consumer, fintech, sports, and media. Now, prior to Phoenix, he has served as a managing general partner of IDG Ventures Vietnam, a private equity firm focused on consumer, technology, media, and telecom investments in Vietnam. Now, Henry, with that, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Really excited to be here.
Now, Henry, you've got a very interesting background. You're an American of Vietnamese descent, and you left Vietnam when you were 22 months old.
Yes.
Walk us through that start in life until your undergraduate degree in Harvard, and then how you got sent back to Vietnam.
Sure. Obviously my family left for the United States in very unfortunate circumstances. The world's been reminded of that now with the goings on in Afghanistan and Kabul. So for my parents, obviously it was a devastating change in their life. All they had built up and all they had worked all their life for in terms of family, career, and obviously what they thought they were doing in terms of contributing to their nation ended quite abruptly. And so while it was difficult for them, if I look back on my life, it was probably one of the great blessings for me as a person because I got to grow up in a country that allowed me to pursue the education I wanted, and to be exposed to so many important things that obviously have affected my life that I'm not sure I would have been able to if my family had stayed in Vietnam or if things had been different. But for me, it's almost cliched because it's a classic immigrant story in America. My parents pretty much lost everything and they started over. And they were just a little bit younger than I am now. So I often try to think about what they went through. If I went through the same thing, how would I be able to manage? But in short, not only did they manage, they thrived in the sense of working so hard. I'm the youngest of four. So, we became really the source of everything they put their hard work and labor into. And by that, I mean education, right? They knew that education was basically the calling card, if you will, that was required if we were going to have a good start in life and also have a foundation for success. And so, those values in terms of learning, in terms of education, they've stayed with me today. And, really for my parents, the greatest way I expressed my gratitude, if you will, was to make sure that I achieved as much as I could and did as best that I could in school. And those achievements, quite honestly, were driven by that want and desire to make sure that I gave my parents some joy and happiness for all the sacrifices they made for my siblings and me.
Now, Henry, you got a scholarship, and this is before university, at high school level, I think you were just before that, to go to Phillips Exeter Academy, which is a prestigious school, very good school, 60 over grand a year, called a tuition fee. And you turned that down to go to, why did you do that?
Well, look, my parents had big aspirations. They really wanted me to get into the best university possible. And obviously, the Phillips Academies, particularly Phillips Exeter, was considered one of the best prep schools and private high schools in America. It still is today. It's still a wonderful school. I often wonder if my girls get of age and if they want to go, I'd love for them to go. But my parents were made aware of some of their scholarships and they had me go interview and visit the school. And by good fortune, I was offered one. But this was after my sophomore year of high school. So I still had 2 more years of high school. And quite frankly, I guess there was a balance of factors that made me initially want to go, but when I thought about it, I wanted to stay. One is, when you're 15 going on 16 and you have all these friends that you've made over, a decade of schooling, it's pretty hard to leave them and leave them early. So, those friendships, they still endure to this day. My 4 closest friends from high school, they're probably one of the big reasons I stayed at my public high school in Virginia. And then secondly, I have to admit this, though I didn't admit it to my parents, it had to do with sports. I was the captain of my lacrosse team, and I knew that if I left, I'd probably be starting over. I'm sure the Phillips Academies have great lacrosse teams, so I didn't want to be the new kid on a new team. I wanted to stay back and get to be, again, with my teammates. And we had goals to win a championship, which we, in the year previous, we didn't make it. So I wanted to stay and make sure I could see it through and achieve that goal for the rest of, in the 2 years I had left in high school. So yeah, again, great blessing and fortune, but I think I made the right decision because, I got to spend obviously 2 more years at home, more time with my parents, more times with my friends. And, I still challenge myself in different ways, with the last 2 years of my high school. I grew up very close to a very good university called George Mason University. So I was able to take classes concurrently with my high school classes. So it all worked out, thankfully.
Now, also that you spent 10 years at university. Now
Yeah.
you got a BA in classics from Harvard University. You went to med school, and then after that you got an MBA from Kellogg School of Business. So obviously top schools. But can I ask you something?
Sure.
Your folks look at you differently when you said you wanted to do the classics at Harvard?
For sure. But
as an Asian parent, especially?
Well, I'll have to say it's not a very big act of rebellion, but I thought that was a small act of rebellion against my parents. Part of my parents' American dream quite openly was that, they wanted all of us to become doctors. So my oldest is my brother, and I have 2 sisters, and then the youngest is me. All 3 of them pursued medical careers and have had wonderful medical careers. My brother went to medical school at the University of Chicago on a Navy scholarship, so he served in the Navy for many years. My sister's also a surgeon. She's now practicing in North Carolina. And the younger of my 2 sisters, she's a professor of medicine at WashU in St. Louis, and also still continues to practice. So in the end, I did deliver a medical degree for my parents, but I didn't practice. So in a weird way, I'm the black sheep in the family because of that. But as I said in the beginning, Brian, that educational pursuit is something I loved and enjoyed, the learning, the challenge. Obviously, it was wonderful to have something in common with my siblings, and they were terrific guides and mentors. And if anything, they probably, dragged me along their coattails into the field of medicine. I do miss it, but I always realized that at some point in my life, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so that journey started a little bit earlier than I expected when I first returned back to Vietnam 20 years ago.
Yeah, so tell us about that. You finished Harvard, and then you had that unexpected opportunity to go to Vietnam. Yeah.
There's little things in your life that end up being the major deflectors, I like to call it. As part of my Harvard experience, one of my summer jobs was writing for our student-published travel guide called Let's Go. And in the year I worked, I was actually looking forward to going to Rome as a classics major, studying all, classical history, antiquities, Greece and Rome. I thought that would be a great capstone to all the years I spent learning the history, culture, and language. But I ended up getting recruited to being the first writer for the Vietnam Guide. I would have to say I was reluctant to switch, but I got, I'll say, gently coerced into doing it. But I say that now, that was the most important summer of my life because I had known very little about Vietnam and had, I will say quite embarrassing, just didn't know much about the language, the culture. I grew up an American suburban kid. So that summer really changed the course of my life and was one of the great, experiences that obviously led me to where I am today. So returning to Vietnam 20 years ago was a product of that. that first trip.
And then, and how did you start out then with IDG Ventures in Vietnam, and walk us through that journey, and also then
Sure.
subsequently you remained in Vietnam?
Yeah. I think all entrepreneurs and all successful people will tell you that when fortune comes knocking on your door, the best thing you can do is to be ready for it. And I was. My good fortune when I was in Vietnam is I served on the board of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hanoi, and we had a visit from a gentleman named Pat McGovern, I'm sorry. But he was the founder and chairman of IDG, which is a technology media company. People probably remember it for, if you were at least a child of the 80s and 90s, all the magazines with World in the title, PC World, Mac World. Then, of course, all the big conferences, Mac World Expo, obviously, where Steve Jobs and Apple famously, still until several years ago, unveiled a lot of their new technology and devices. But he had gotten into venture capital in China in the 90s. And so in the early 2000s, he wanted to do the same in Vietnam. And because I hosted that trip for him and spent a lot of time with him, he basically tapped me to open up IDG Ventures in Vietnam. So that chance meeting, if you will, and the relationship built there led into us starting the first venture capital and private equity firm in Vietnam.
And then fast forward, you worked at IDG Ventures, and then you then became an entrepreneur on your own, with various food and sports ventures, not only in Vietnam, but also in the US.
Yeah. So, I was an entrepreneur since I was 10 years old, and I remember the newspaper route that started it all. Back in the day, when people still read newspapers and the Washington Post had a major circulation where I grew up, I was able to secure a newspaper route that ended up becoming multiple routes that I basically hired my friends to work with me. So,
wow.
These entrepreneurial ventures carried on through my time in college and medical school. In fact, my friends and I had an awesome student medical publishing business through all my years in medical school. So even while I was in school, I was always, I thought, running a business on the side. But if I look back now, I've always been running businesses. In school was what I was doing on the side. So when I got back to Vietnam, the great joy for me was obviously starting this new firm and venture fund, which was a terrific startup in and of itself. Back then, there was still very ambiguous and unclear laws in terms of foreign investment, never mind venture capital and technology investments in Vietnam. The term venture capital itself didn't exist. Very famously now over the last probably 5 to 7 years throughout this region, startup has become a native word in almost all these languages, from Bahasa to Vietnamese to Tagalog, et cetera. But, 20 years ago, startup, people would look at you and not know, if you were from another planet or not. So being able to be there kind of at the very beginning, it's good to have those memories, but quite frankly, there were times when it was difficult and frustrating. But to see and to be, partners with so many of the early entrepreneurs here who really set the stage for this current wave is the really gratifying part of it. And I'm still, gratified and happy to continue to be part of this whole startup and technology scene here in Vietnam and in the region.
Henry, what were your big winners from IDG Ventures?
Well, the biggest one probably everybody knows is the first unicorn from Vietnam is VNG. Its initial founding name was Vina Game because they initially started off as one of the online game publishers here in Vietnam, but they've obviously built and diversified their business into all sorts of technology, including the #1 communications platform in Zalo, in fintech with their Zalo Pay, in digital media with Zing. So it's quite a very diversified and large business now, and gaming still remains at its core. A lot of other companies that are in either fintech, such as Mocha, companies in digital media like VC Core, Gold Sun Focus Media. It's a list of 50, so it's pretty cool to see many of them still thriving, and of course, obviously, from an investor's perspective, we're able to return good returns for our investors.
Now, you also on your personal side, you've got a couple of food ventures. You brought McDonald's into Vietnam.
Yeah. So McDonald's is really, how do I want to put it? It's almost like the immigrant kids image of America. And here as proof, my two favorite brands are still Coca-Cola and McDonald's. It's the classic being an immigrant. I played baseball. I wanted to be an all-American kid. So McDonald's and Coca-Cola were these two brands that have been with me my whole life. And obviously returning back to Vietnam, the things that I continue to miss, if you will, even though I loved being in Vietnam, was American food. Back then, also sports. I couldn't get or readily watch the sports I'd grown to love growing up stateside. So, those were things that stayed in the back of my mind. And with McDonald's, I just remember when KFC first opened in Hanoi when I was living there in the early 2000s, the first question that popped in my head was, I wonder why McDonald's is not here. And again, being sort of in of the good fortune of having gone to business school at Kellogg, the headquarters McDonald's is in Chicago. So I had a lot of friends who graduated from Kellogg who worked at McDonald's. So I just found my way to the head of international franchising there and the leadership there. And I basically hounded them for a decade until we finally opened in 2014.
It took a decade. What was their reluctance to open? And because you're the master franchisor, right?
Yes.
In Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a multitude of factors. Part of it is corporate. If people remember, through the 90s and into the early 2000s, McDonald's did a lot of expansion into new markets. They acquired brands. People may or may not remember, but they owned brands like Boston Market, Chipotle, Donato's Pizza, because they thought to compete with Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, they needed to have this portfolio of brands. But as top line grew, profitability actually kind of flatlined. And McDonald's, as I like to say, is a widows and orphans stock. That dividend and that predictable growth is a major part of their shareholder value. And when they basically strayed from that strategy, they started getting punished in terms of their stock price. So starting in the early 2000s, the CEO who finally emerged, a gentleman named Jim Skinner, his message to the market was, we don't need to get bigger to get better. It was about focusing on same-store sales. It was about really focusing on their core business. So they eventually shed and sold those other brands. And they basically said to Wall Street, we're not going to open new markets. So that was exactly the window I interfaced with them. So, in that sort of period of 2004 to 2012, I believe their stock price went from the low teens all the way above 100. So the messaging and the strategy was working. So opening a new market in Vietnam, which wasn't going to move the needle for them, and also would have changed their messaging, I think is one of the main critical reasons why. The other ones is it's a lot of work to open a new market, particularly when it comes to making sure the supply chains are in place and being able to ensure that global McDonald's standard is delivered. And that's a costly endeavor if you don't expect and plan to have the growth and scale within a specific period of time.
Now, you also, because of your passion in sports that goes back to high school, as you mentioned, captain of the lacrosse team, you've heavily invested in the sports business. Now, you have a number of sports teams in Vietnam. You also own the LA Football Club. Tell us about your sports investments.
Sure. Well, look, here in Vietnam, a lot of times, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs will tell you this, you kind of look at the status quo and you see things that are deficient or things that are missing that you think could be better. And for me in Vietnam, one of the things I missed, as I mentioned earlier, not just watching sports, but just being able to participate in more sports, particularly ones that I was interested in. So as you know, here in Vietnam and across this region, football is king, right?
Yeah.
It's football, and everything else is usually a distant second, except for maybe when we talk about our friends in the Philippines, where it's flipped with basketball. But for me, I wanted to get involved, and I knew over time that, you know, sports would become a more important part of people's lives here as the economy grew and as people attained middle-class status. And I always knew how much sports contributed to my life in terms of, you know, camaraderie, in terms of teamwork, in terms of just a wonderful experience in learning how to fit in and be an integral part of a group. So, you know, really, I just wanted to replicate that. And that really started in the beginning with basketball. Actually, the connection here with ASEAN is, you know, we had already started sort of sports training programs here. I started something with a partner named Saigon Sports Academy. So we were training tennis, swimming, basketball, football, etc. But then Tony Fernandez, founder of AirAsia, but also one of the founders of the ASEAN Basketball League, gave me a ring and said, "Hey, look, we want to have a team in Vietnam." And so that started this whole journey of, well, let's go ahead and start a pro basketball team here in Saigon and participate in this regional league. And so that was the anchor team. It's called Saigon Heat. That several years later, we started a domestic pro basketball league, which now has 8 teams in it and is continuing to grow. So, you know, what's gratifying for me in many ways, and I think anybody with an entrepreneurial mindset will understand. Of course, you know, there are things that I've done, and I have a lot of friends who are involved in the game of football here. But, you know, basketball and other sports, I'll call it the underdog sports. So it's been fun to grow basketball almost from zero to now. Clearly the second most popular sport in Vietnam, and being able to see greater basketball participation, fans and whatnot. So that's been a big part of that journey here in Vietnam. In addition to that, here in Vietnam, you know, a big part of my experience from, you know, high school through university was sports. As you know, the big sports organization in the US that's a consortium of all the universities is called the NCAA. And so we created our version of the NCAA here because I really felt, again, that competition is what creates school pride, it creates identities for all the different universities, allows alumni to re-engage. And that's the same type of environment and the way sports operates in the US. You know, the way I like to put it is, you know, a lot of professors or students win, you know, Nobel Prizes or Rhodes Scholarships. And when I read the news about it, I'm extremely proud of my alma mater. But the one time that I've gone back to campus the most, or the one time I get to talk about Harvard among my friends, is when we beat Yale in football. So, you know, sports has its place, it has its meaning. You know, it's not nothing, but it's not everything, but it has, I think, a real important place in making sure that you still keep your heart and spirit with your institution. So that's kind of how we started the intercollegiate sports here in Vietnam. And believe it or not, this is an example of reverse entrepreneurialism, because the whole you know, football club, the soccer, I should be careful because when you say football in America, they think the American football in terms of the NFL. But you know, I saw soccer or global football as the underdog sport in America. And so, you know, almost a decade ago, I started this project to see if we could start a new club in Major League Soccer, which is the first division in the US. And over the course of about 2.5 years, we were able to get the deal done, build a stadium right in downtown LA. And we started a club called LAFC, so Los Angeles Football Club. We're the rivals to the LA Galaxy, probably because everybody knows them because of David Beckham. But yeah, that's been one of the most you know, rewarding and exciting projects of the last several years of my life.
And you've also got very interesting co-investors, everyone from Chad Hurley to Tony Robbins to Magic Johnson to even a Asian connection there from Malaysia, Vincent Tan.
And Ruben, yeah. So look, in my life as a business person and as an entrepreneur, like you never do anything alone, right? Start with great partners. You start with great advisors, investors, and then of course you build a great team and you really empower them to do what they are meant to do in terms of their talents and their hard work, et cetera. So, being in the fortunate position I've been in so many really exciting and interesting projects has allowed me to bring together a lot of very, very highly skilled people who have tremendous amount of experiential capital, intellectual capital, and relationship capital to make things happen. And that's been, again, one of the great experiences and lessons in all of these projects.
Now, I want to zoom in now on Teemo Bank. Your newest baby, you're the CEO. Tell us about this digital bank and the motivation for starting it.
Actually, this bank was started 6 years ago by a very good friend of mine, Don Lam, who probably, if many people who do pay attention to Vietnam or investors in Vietnam know him very well. He's one of the founders of Viet Capital, which is one of the largest investment firms here in Vietnam. And I think he, like me, saw the changes that were happening and how quickly they were happening, particularly in rapidly growing economies like Vietnam, thanks to technology. And because he was very close to, financial services and the financial services sector here in Vietnam, he wanted to take a lead there. And so he started Teemo actually 6 years ago, and we stayed in touch. We talked a lot about where this was going and what his plans were. And so his initial start was with one of the large private commercial banks here. And in the first 4 years of their partnership, they grew very fast to, I think, well over close to 400,000 customers. And you can imagine at a time where people were still not used to doing any of their financial interactions, never mind online or mobile, it was quite an achievement. But their partnership with that bank was ending. And so that's when our conversation started a couple of years ago. And I knew that this was a tremendous opportunity to really, build upon the foundations that the Teemo team and Don had built up to that point. And so we reset our relationship with a new bank that also became one of our principal stakeholders. It's Viet Capital Bank, of which Phoenix Holdings is a shareholder of, and also allowed us to have that kind of stakeholder alignment on two sides. And so, I'll put it this way, quite simply, Brian, it was such an exciting project that, when we were doing our CEO search, I kind of jumped out of my chair and you do this. The impact, the potential, and obviously as a business, its potential is remarkable. And so I just wanted to be a part of that. And also maybe I was itching to get off the sidelines a little bit and get back into a more day-to-day executive role. But it's been extremely gratifying and a really fast year so far. Yeah.
And Teemo is also really, if you really take a step back, it's a financial inclusion story, isn't it? Because the Vietnamese government is, on one hand, pushing for innovation. The banking sector in Vietnam has been a little bit behind the curve in the past, but the government wants 80% of the adult population to be banked by 2025.
That's right. That's right. You're right to say that there's a conservatism that runs through the regulatory bodies here and the policymakers. Rhetorically, though, they really want things to move fast, and I think they're starting to realize that they cannot shape or guide that. They'll just have to create the framework to allow different companies and entrepreneurs to really push to reach those type of goals. And absolutely, that's totally right. And I think obviously there's so many of the same countries in this region that have the same kind of demographics, the same type of conditions in terms of a very, very large population that remains unbanked, and even the banked is underbanked in the sense of not really conforming to or serving those needs. So that's the huge opportunity that we see for Timo here in Vietnam, but we also see throughout the region. And obviously, there's many other players. If you look to the Philippines, to Indonesia, and in recent times now with Singapore and Malaysia opening up bids, it's becoming quite an active space.
Now, is that from a Vietnam, from an execution strategy, is that a click and mortar type of pure digital execution? Because if you use of an example like Time Bank out of South Africa, theirs was basically an execution strategy that's a click and mortar. It's not 100% digital. What's your strategy moving forward?
Now, obviously, you have to really understand your market, right? Of course, we're digital only in the sense of we're not going to build a network of hundreds of branches because that's not really how people transact anymore. That's traditional banking. And of course, the banks that have been operating here for decades, they built their market on that because that's what the market demanded. Today, you really want to be a great user experience, and so much of people's transactional lives are being done digitally. And not only just digitally, but through their mobile device. So understanding that and cracking that code is a major part of being successful. That's not to say that you don't need physical presences. For instance, our partnership with 7-Eleven is really, really extremely important because it allows us over time to be able to have all these physical points of presence where we can do transactions. So the best way I can put it is, probably the largest commercial bank in Vietnam today has about 1,000 branches, or as they often like to say, transaction points. In 5 years, there will be plenty more than 1,000 7-Elevens. So there will be much more touch points for a customer to come in touch with Timo than potentially even your bank. That's even true today in terms of how we've worked with NAPAS, which is the global or the national network of ATMs and the central bank switch here. Instead of just having your own network of a couple thousand ATMs, we're connected to the whole NAPAS network of ATMs, which means now there's over 40,000 places that you can withdraw, in some places with CDMs where you can also make deposits into your accounts. So for us, it's really taking advantage of partnerships and the infrastructure that exists to make sure that Timo remains the most convenient, the most relevant, and the easiest to use and the most valuable for any and all of our customers.
Now, I want to zoom in and get your insights on what you think success will look like for Timo in 2 or 3 years' time.
Obviously, look, we need to continue to build our network of partnerships. So for instance, connecting with some of the largest fintech players in this market, connect to the largest wallet like Momo. We want to make sure that, the way I like to put it is Timo plus partner equals, exponential value for our users. And of course, building those networks and partnerships take time. Integrating it in a real and relevant way is not just technology. It's a lot of product work. It's a lot of interfacing between, two companies and teams. So for sure, building our network of services and creating valuable services for our users in the next 2-3 years. Of course, growing number of users, right? Similar to the Philippines and Indonesia, more than 2 out of 3 people here in Vietnam are unbanked. So there is this whole market that's waiting to be addressed. And of course, the question remains, well, why haven't they been addressed before? Well, quite frankly, a lot of banks, given their cost structure, given a lot of their constraints, it's very expensive to serve a customer that maybe one of your branches can't serve, and you can't reach out to them, and maybe they don't have the assets that you need to maintain accounts that are profitable. The thing that technology enables and affords us is to be able to serve these customers with a cost basis that allows us to reach out and integrate so many more and bring so much more into the financial system. There's so much friction in the system as well in terms of just getting other basic needs met in terms of credit and loans, right? That's clearly one of the most important functions that any fintech entity that it's worth is to be able to address those problems and overcome those barriers. So for us, obviously, it's number of new customers that come onto our platform, and also increasing the volume of transactions, the amount of assets and deposits that are in our system, because that means we'll be an expression of our healthy ecosystem and relevancy to the marketplace.
You were in very early on Vietnam's growth wave. Now,
yeah.
Where do you see the opportunities in Vietnam in the next 5 years?
Yeah, you know what? One thing I'll share, Brian. I've been here 20 years, and it's been remarkable how fast things have changed, how the economy has grown in these 20 years. But I so deeply believe the next 20 years are going to be many-fold better. And part of it is there's so many more people now that are in the financial system, in the economic system, that weren't before. There's so much more wealth and wealth creation that's happening, from the lowest levels of the pyramid all the way to the top. Business and private enterprise have really led the way here. And I see that continuing to grow and expand over the next 20 years. So for the next 5 years, really what I see is now you have a whole cohort that I call Vietnam's golden generation. So I will say, if we just use the global sort of millennials definition of those born in the late 80s beyond, you have basically 2/3 of Vietnam that's born from that point onward. They're digital native, they're sophisticated, they're worldly, they're in the prime of their earning and also spending power. So, things will grow in terms of, consumer services here, particularly in financial services. The banking sector is going to grow. Obviously, a lot of real estate investment and other infrastructural investments have been taking place. And all of this, frankly, is riding upon the changes in technology, right? We still call things e-commerce in the developing world here, because a lot of the entrants are relatively new in terms of less than 5 or even less than 10 years old. But as you know from developed markets, commerce is commerce, right? Like Amazon is not e-commerce anymore. In fact, Amazon, I think last month was the first month ever that they sold more goods than Walmart. So this is where the world's headed. It's digital, it's technology enabled. And for us, from a banking and financial services perspective, and what we're trying to do with Teemo is be that next generation of banking services, of other financial services, and meeting those consumer needs in a much less costly, lower friction, and more relevant way that creates value for customers.
Henry, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
No, thank you, Brian. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Now, we've been speaking to Henry Nguyen, the CEO of Timo, on Biztech's CEO Conversation Show. I'm Brian Fernandez. Please check out our Facebook and LinkedIn sites, as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please like and subscribe to our various platforms. Thank you very much for tuning in.